This is a style that I would say is probably the most common now. And I will say off the top, if you're in doubt, do this. If you don't know what you're doing, just do this style of rising RPE throughout the block, especially on the primary day, and then do that in either a 4-week or 5-week training cycle. That simple. So unlike static RPE, you're gonna have to pick a duration. At least I recommend it. I mean, you in theory could not, but it'd probably get pretty messy. So for the most part, pick your training cycle duration. I would say very few people benefit more from a 3-week cycle or a 6-week cycle than a 4-week or a 5-week cycle. So I would just pick between 4 and 5. And then if anything, what you want to adjust is where your start point is, if it's RP6 or RP5 or even lower, which all have been done, which we'll go over in some specific programs. And they're all very effective as long as it makes sense as far as the endpoint. Also, some of the other points that we're going to get to on some of the negatives, we'll kind of cover that. So before I get into that, though, let's get into the positives. Let's really reiterate those. So first of all, the biggest positive is fatigue management and momentum. So this has much more direction than a training cycle that's completely static. Typically, it's 3 cycles of either 4 or 5 weeks. So here I recommend either a 12-week macro cycle with 3 mesocycles within that, or a 15-week macro cycle with 3 5-week mesocycles within that. So either way completely works. Now, here you know that typically what's going to be best is to actually hit your heaviest set around a month out at the end of that second mesocycle, and then just make sure 1 week out you're a little bit heavier than you were 5 weeks out, essentially. So make sure your second last week doesn't, so 1 week out you don't have to hit necessarily your openers. I mean, you can, but you don't have to as long as 4 weeks out went well, because now you're riding that wave and you're counting that you're going to have a similar ratio as that wave drives up. So one of the big benefits here, like I mentioned, is fatigue management. And then also you can push accessories a little bit harder because now you have a little bit of extra space. You're not necessarily, Brandon Campbell actually mentioned this on his doing the static training, that he was like, he only did a handful of movements. It might be 3 barbell movements in a given workout, but it actually took him much longer than he expected, and took him even longer than some of the other programs they did with more accessories.
And each day, I'm only doing 3 movements. And that's a big change for me because I've coming off of programs where I've done a ton of accessory movements. Past that, 3 exercises, not a lot of volume, in and out of the gym. I'll probably only be down there for an hour, which I was kind of looking forward to. I've had some longer sessions in the past with some of the hypertrophy blocks I was coming off of. And I couldn't have been more wrong. In fact, on average, these sessions, 3 exercises with low volume, have been taking me longer. And I think a big part of that is they're all compound movements. Most, if not all, are working up to a heavy single at 8 to start. And when I'm talking about benching, squatting, or deadlifting, that's relatively heavier weight. So there's more warm-up sets involved. There's more rest in between. It's just been taking a lot of time. So I was really kind of thrown for a little bit of a loop with that.
And I think that's a very common experience. Whereas when you're training more sub-max with the barbell work, now you have more time and energy to push those hack squats hard, to push those leg extensions harder. And there's just more of a separation here. Now, this also is why, which I'll cover in the linear periodization with some extra sauce on it, we'll cover some differences there, where I will say that it depends on how you do it, but ascending sets can definitely be very effective for more advanced lifters, because the more advanced you get, the more separation there is between hypertrophy through the barbell movements and hypertrophy through accessories. Basically, the stronger you get, eventually you have to build muscle through like lat pull downs, through leg extensions, through hamstring curls, and it gets a little bit harder to truly try to hit effective, sets all the time through like the actual barbell deadlift or the barbell squat itself or the bench press consistently. One other positive compared to static RPE is that because you are predetermining a top-down plan, one upside is a lot of times it's a little bit better to leave with some momentum in the tank and then go into the next phase versus just kind of statically running something until it doesn't work and then resetting. Now, in theory, you could argue it doesn't matter if you're a week too late or a week too early, but in practice, especially mentally in terms of motivation, but also in terms of the risk, let's say of injury. I hate to say of risk of injury too much.
We do not speak his name.
Because you don't want to fearmonger. Injury risks are very low in powerlifting, but they still exist. And sometimes we see it where someone tears a callus going heavy on the deadlift for just 1 more week than they really should have. Whereas when you're doing this, you're riding this wave and then resetting, you're not really risking just feeling like you're slamming into a wall as much. You're resetting before that moment hits. And then I've seen a lot of people stack together many, many really good 4-week phases and not really need to even experiment with doing like a 6-week phase or 7-week phase, even if they could get away with it. So that's one really big positive, especially when it comes to kind of making this a more universal approach. And again, the big thing is when you're coaching yourself for powerlifting, you don't need to do everything absolutely perfect. You need to do it really effectively and then just go in motivated. And if you work hard and motivated, you're already going to be ahead of so many people as long as you're just doing things, rationally enough. So that being said, let's get into some of the negative points. Now, this actually can get pretty conceptual here because this is going to be nuanced and it's going to be really related to especially intermediate lifters versus advanced lifters. Now, one risk that can happen when it comes to ascending RPE is if you take an intermediate lifter and you have them doing a little bit too much submax work, especially on the back off work, and spending a little bit too much time on that submax work, you can actually have some interesting things happen mechanistically because technically as RPE is rising throughout a block, you're actually increasing the amount of effective reps hit for hypertrophy. So what you're actually doing is really the opposite of what most of us would think with periodization. You're hitting effectively more volume later in the cycle. So a lot of people are used to high volume at the start of the cycle and then decrease it. That's linear periodization. And then static RPE obviously keeps it 100% similar across time. But the weird thing with ascending RPE is that an RP5 set of a 4x4, let's just say like on average, it's a RP5. If it ends at RP7.5 or RP8 or even just RP7.0, that's going to legitimately be as if you added a few sets in terms of hypertrophic stimulus and in terms of fatigue accumulated. So one of the interesting things, especially as an intermediate lifter, is you do want to make sure that you're hitting enough volume throughout, and volume on paper may not actually be volume in terms of what's building muscle through the competition lifts. So the simplest way to put it is that there can be this discrepancy between what's effective for strength and what's effective for building muscle. And intermediate lifters need to make sure that they're doing both really in harmony. And to give you some concrete data on this, there was a meta regression for both strength and for hypertrophy when looking at RPE thresholds. And this makes it very clear. So if you look at effective reps or what's the best RPE for building muscle, here we see that closer to failure is more effective. So we kind of know this, obviously, that the last 5 reps or so of like a RP10 set are the most effective. Now, I will say, as a subtle point here, the fact that you can see so many studies with 6 reps even in reserve. Conceptually, the fact that 6 reps in reserve was the most effective hypertrophic stimulus shows that effective reps as a literal concept on paper, that anything that's RP5 has 0 effective reps is not true. Okay, so that's the good thing, and that's good for what we're talking about here with starting a little bit lower and then going up, is that you still are having some similarity in terms of a stimulus. However, when we do look at RPE for strength, we see that there's basically no magic RPE for strength. So as you go up in RPE, it's not like then all of a sudden strength is really shooting up. Instead, it's a very flat overall meta regression. So with that in mind, that introduces the idea that actually training with lower RPE, but especially with higher set count and really low RPE, what you can get is a really positive medium-term strength adaptation without having that long-term hypertrophic adaptation as effectively. And that can create a really interesting twist of incentives because I think a lot of people are used to the idea that going a little bit lighter is prioritizing the long-term, and going heavier is like kind of pushing for short-term boosts, right? And just in general. But the fact that these two are different shows that what can happen, and I'll give a concrete example, is we can imagine someone running, let's say they're gonna hit 80%, 85%, or let's say that 75%, 80%, 85%, 90%. Let's say they wanna make those jumps, have that clear direction. Well, if someone's doing, let's say 4x4s the whole way through, then week 1 is going to be super easy. Week 2 is going to be, pretty much super easy. And then week 3 is going to be, pretty hard. And then week 4 is going to be really hard, right? And if you were to instead take each set to roughly RP7 all throughout, maybe you'd do a 2x7 with 75%. With similar total reps, let's say. So let's say you do a 2x7 with 75%. And then let's say maybe you hit 5s or 6s on week 2. And then by week 3, you're hitting 5s again. And week 4, you end at a 4x4 as well. Well, now you ended at the same point And on one, you kept RPE really similar. So then you're actually getting a more consistent hypertrophic stimulus as long as you're adjusting set count to accommodate for that, which we'll get to more later. Whereas the ramping up RPE group, it's really almost like you just had super easy training the first 2 weeks, and then you push yourself the last 2 weeks. So the main point being is that is effective, and as long as you're stacking together successful cycles and pushing accessories hard, I think that you are making up for it. But it is just something to consider. So that is an interesting point to keep in mind, is that you have to push hard with the barbell movements if you want to build muscle with them, and you shouldn't be afraid of that as an intermediate or earlier lifter. So that's why of the people who benefit the most from having RPE ramp up, by far the biggest group of people typically is really strong guys with high absolute strength, and then guys who are not built as well to handle volume on the lift. So if you have longer femurs. Now, I do think everybody is built for it, to be clear. So I'm not trying to box it in or something like that. This is my preferred training style for people beyond a certain level of advancement. I will say, definitely for beginners and early intermediates, I think it can waste a lot of time, to be honest. So I would not start out with this style, especially to like RP5 or 6 starting points. I would push a little bit harder, more consistently. Clearly in your first 1 to 3 years of lifting in general, not just like powerlifting specific, but just lifting in general, you got to push yourself hard first. So one consideration is to just make sure that you don't spam a ton of volume, because this can get really dangerous. Because if you have a big drop off in terms of, let's say you have 1x4 at RP6, and then you have like an 8 or 12% or more intensity drop on the volume work, well, then it can be really tricky to know what actual level of volume you should be using, because you have the freedom to spam too much volume. So that's one thing that's very important, is as you're using this riding the wave RP up, to make sure that you keep volume in mind for the week 4 rather than keep volume in mind for week 1, if you know what I mean. Because if you go, I could handle 8 sets of 2 on the squat just easy on week 1, and then you let it ramp up, by week 4 you may be able to get through it, but you might be frying yourself out, because now you have so much freedom to really start off harder, because you're not going to pay the consequences until that week 3 or week 4. And in general, we don't want to redline anyways. So that's a big point to emphasize, is just because you can handle everything easier the first 2 weeks with ascending RPE typically than static RPE typically, don't make up that difference in volume. Let it just be easier and go, okay, now I'm feeling fresh. And then go into that week 3 and week 4. Now this brings me to a program example that I wanted to talk about. And this is Brandon Tiet's program in his Submax program from a handful of years ago. I'm going to be pretty blunt on what I would do differently, and specifically why I think this is a useful example for what I'm talking about. So first of all, this is, in my opinion, a top 2 free powerlifting program. I would say Brandon's and Steve DeNovi's 15-week program are 2 of the best free programs on the internet, and both of them are ramping up RPE. So that makes it very clear just how much I recommend this style. However, in my opinion, Brandon's program does have one issue that I would change, which is week 4 of the first 4-week phase. And the issue isn't anything that's, objective. This is, to some level, opinionated, right? That's the whole point of this. So I do want to just get all these disclaimers out the way and then say my opinion. Okay, what I think the problem is I think with certain ramping up programs, and just in general, the concept that can become an issue is that week 4 becomes so different from week 1. So for example, if we look at this program, basically the first primary day is RP6 on the squat, and then the pause squat is also RP6 on the top set of squats. And then overall, there's a lot of volume. So again, this can be very easy to kind of look at initially and go, okay, this is going to be a lot of volume, but I can handle it. Let's get into this, because ultimately we're starting out light and we're going to give ourselves time. But then the difference between someone who would thrive off of RP6 and who would thrive off of the end at week 4 at RP9, that just might be 2 different people. And that's the fundamental potential issue, is that just that week 4 might just slap you in the face, because by week 4, then it's a top set of 5 at RP9 on a 6-set competition squat day with an AMRAP on the 6th set. And then you also have a 4x7 pause squat starting at RP9. And then you still have like a 4x3 competition squat as a 3rd squat day with around 7 to 8% increase from week 1, which, maybe it would be pretty similar in terms of RP, so I don't think that one is too crazy. But in terms of those jumps on those RP9 days back to back, it just might be one of those things where that's going to really slap you in the face with block periodization, because again, now you're actually increasing the effective volume, really. in terms of the amount of effective reps, rather than even having it be a clean block in terms of everything being the same. And that's, like I said, just inherent to this programming style. So basically what can become a problem is that the relationship within the week can start to get a little bit chaotic on certain slots because you're now ramping everything up. So as far as the solutions go, there's really three main ways that, in my opinion, you can make this program better. And the second one is the way that I prefer, but I'm going in order of most likely solutions. So the first one is to simply make the jumps less on the variation. This is typically what I do because let's say the pause squat starts RP6, competition squats RP6. Well, then the competition squat can jump a full RP, but it doesn't mean that all slots have to. So then I would have the pause squat go RP6, RP6.5, RP7, and then just end at RP7.5. So that way, then you can push that competition squat to RP9. You still have the momentum rolling in. And also, most importantly, you're still hitting effective reps on that variation slot. Because if you were to just shift everything down and let's say start the pause squat at RP5 or 4, yeah, you can do that, especially with advanced lifters, but I would say you're kind of running the risk of not hitting effective work as often. Whereas if you start RP6 or 6.5 still, and then just take it a little bit slower with those smaller jumps, now you're really getting what you want out of that variation slot itself. Typically momentum is the most important on that heavy competition lift. And then the second solution, this is a little bit more of a creative one, and I would say this one is the least in the spirit of the program, to be totally blunt, but it's kind of more of something that I would consider, would be simply flipping the days and having the pause squat day be first, the competition squat day be second, and then just offsetting where you're going to hit that RP9 pause squat. So if you wanted to keep that intensity, and let's say an earlier intermediate lifter, this would be something I would consider maybe a little bit more strongly, would be start the pause squat at RP7 and just hit 7, 8, 9, and then have the competition squat continue to be 6, 7, 8, 9, and then just make early week 4 actually be an easy, basically deload type taper day into that final competition squat day. Now, of course, the big concern there is you don't want to be tapering too much to where you're like putting too much value on an intro phase, which this is an intro 4-week block of a longer macro cycle. So I understand why some people wouldn't do that. And that's why typically the way I like to program it, if I'm going to do this to capture momentum, is have it be a 5-week phase. So that way you get 4 weeks of really good volume. So then you could actually do 6, 7, 8, 9 on the pause squat. And then actually on the competition squat, also go 5, 6, 7, 8, and then end to 9. But then again, at that early 5th week, actually have basically a deload day starting it off, like 3x5 at RP7 on average, or maybe just extend load slightly heavier than the back offs with no top set on the pause squat, and then still have that big competition squat primary day at the end of week 5. In that way, you're a little bit extra ready for it, but you're not tapering in terms of 1 week out. On that primary squat day on week 4, you're not reducing volume at all. So it still wouldn't be a total competition taper. It would just be that week 5 is low volume and higher intensity. And again, that's just my preference. I just like that way to really get some momentum going, but you still have 4 weeks of really quality, no compromises on volume. Now, the third option would be to simply have it be static RP and just have it be like RP7 the whole way through and not change anything else. And I think that actually would be quite effective in this program. That would be sufficient. That would be definitely a minimum sufficient intensity. But the back off percentages would probably have to be raised to be a little bit closer to straight sets. Still maybe a 5 to 7% drop off. But then you couldn't do the progressive drop off to where you're dropping off 12%. Because to Brandon's credit, he did a great job at managing the back off percentages, gradually increasing so that then it wasn't just overcooking everything. So that all being said, again, obviously this is a fantastic program. Again, I highly recommend it. These are just adjustments that I would make, and I think it is a great example of some of the potential pitfalls of a really big difference between week 1 and week 4, and how for some people it could become just too different of a stimulus, and just how to manage that and maybe mitigate it a little bit. So in summary of ascending RPE, where I recommend this is honestly for most cases. For most cases on the primary day, especially where you're having a top set of 3 or top set of 2, whatever that focus is, to have a ascending RP, and you could do different things on the back off as far as either basing it off of percentages or whatever you want to do. But I would actually probably recommend both the primary day and the variation, as long as you're keeping both in a strict block, to have both have rising RPE. I do think it's an effective way to do things. You can also do, for example, one thing I really like is RP 6.5 on like a high bar, and then actually go to RP 7 with moderate hype on week 2, and then on week 3 go to RP 7 with high hype on that top set, and then on week 4 go to RP 8 with high hype. So you also don't have to take perfectly even jumps, and that's a really big thing to emphasize. But again, I will say there are some programs or even programs I highly recommend. For example, Steve Denovi's 15-week program is, in my opinion, the best of all the totally free programs. If I ran that, to be honest, the back off squat sets, because I'm well built to squat and I can handle volume well and can handle not just volume well in terms of set count, because I actually don't have that high of set count. It's more so I can hit reps really well and just bring high intensity and take really long rests if I need to. I mean, I would honestly not be hitting like almost any RP 7 or even 6 or 5 sets on these back off sets. I'd be hitting a lot of RP 2s and 3s or below. And that's a situation where it just depends on the person, where some people do need higher intensity or more consistent stimulating reps throughout a program. And that is where we're going to get to some interesting tools when it comes to our third option. And that is going to be linear periodization with seasoning.
Cooking up, boy. Linear periodization with seasoning.